It's time for Conversations with Bob. Today I'm joined by Sam Rosenberg. And Sam and I are going to talk today about a side of the shooter situation that's not discussed nearly enough, and that is personal safety. It seems like when the shootings happen, people immediately go into their political mode. Everyone's waiting for government to do something. No one's talking about what you as an individual can do to make yourself safe in this thing that keeps happening. And when I'm talking about shootings, I'm not referring to where the killer and the victims have a relationship. There's some beef between them or some crime, activity. What I'm talking about is people going to work, going to school, going to their place of worship, and getting shot at. So welcome, Sam. I'm so glad you could join me today.
Thank you, Bob. I'm glad to be here. Good to talk to you again.
Could you give us a quick background?
You bet. So I've been in the business, Bob, of protecting people and organizations and teaching them how to protect themselves really for the greater part of my adult life. So 1996, I got out of the Marines. I was a Marine officer. I kind of landed in the close protection world, and which is a fancy pants way of saying bodyguarding. Protected a variety of people from high-profile individuals, celebrities, dignitaries, to executives. And what was interesting around this time, and some of the folks that I was protecting are very well-known individuals. Probably the highest profile person I protected at the time that I can talk about was Benjamin Netanyahu when he was the former prime minister of Israel. And it was an interesting time, but, I developed the philosophy that to me it's good to have a lifeguard, but ultimately you should know how to swim. So 2003, I started teaching people the same skills and tools that we would use to protect public figures so you can protect yourselves and your families and your organizations. Relevant to our conversation today, I've been specifically addressing the active shooter phenomena and the dynamic of personal protection around that, both for individuals and organizations since 2004. So the way that came about, Bob, very simply was, I started teaching. A number of folks came to me who happened to be school teachers, said, they're teaching us lockdown kind of protocols, but what do we do if we come face to face with an active shooter and an armed intruder? What do we do? And so I started teaching around that, and I realized that there was this void in the continuum, that there was really nothing between intruder alert, if you will, and law enforcement response. So, in keeping with what you were just talking about, the reality is that we as citizens generally have been taught to believe that we really need to rely on the lifeguards, and we know they're going to be there, and we know that every lifeguard that I've ever worked with definitely would want to be there in the moment of truth to help and save lives. But there's going to be a lag, and if we're there, we have to know how to swim.
I attended one of your active shooter classes. It was a public class. You did it for free in the Hill District. And in the first 5 minutes, you blew me away. I mean, one of the opening things you guys mentioned was that under severe stress, and that the human brain, if it has nowhere to go, it doesn't really know how to handle this situation. It just shuts down. Mm-hmm. And that just made me think of how airline pilots, when you hear the crisis situation, they speak very calmly, matter of fact. Mm-hmm. Apollo 13 was, Houston, we have a problem. Mm-hmm. It was like, we're all going to die is what the problem is, but we have to be calm. We have to, and they're trained to be that way. That doesn't come natural. And how you mentioned, I remember Pulse Nightclub, I think, was around the same time. People just, quote, played dead.
Yeah.
And realizing that wasn't necessarily a conscious decision. They just they just could not handle this enormous stress. And I don't think anyone can imagine how I've never been in a firefight, but I've been at the gun range where there's 10, 20 people firing all at the same time. I can't imagine being on the other end of that, how much stressful that must be.
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly it. I mean, if we boil it down very simplistically, almost too simplistically, the greater the stress, the lower our capacity to think and make good decisions. Okay, And, when we really look at this dynamic of how do we perform under stress, it always comes back that it has very little to do with our physicality, of how big, how strong, how athletic we are. It really comes back to our ability to think and make decisions under pressure. And the only way that we can do that is through prior training. There's a great quote that's kind of a military maxim nowadays, but it's a almost 2,000-year-old quote. And what it is that we don't rise to the occasion, we fall to the level of our training. And this is a very truthful saying, because what happens is, in a very simple way, when we receive stimuli that we don't have any experience with, we don't suddenly have the ability to manage it and to start to come up with solutions to the problem. What we're most likely to do is simply freeze. This has been demonstrated in every possible, capacity, from emergencies that have nothing to do with human violence to other kinds of natural disasters, to other kinds, fires or aircraft, accidents, to you name it. It's the worst possible dynamic is when we're faced with human violence. And I would say the two most extremes of that would be the mass homicide event or an attempted sexual assault. Those two things are so severe to the human psychology that if you haven't prepared in advance for that, what is most likely to happen is a degree of paralysis that falls into the category of clinically what is called tonic immobility. Tonic immobility is playing dead, not knowing what to do, so being completely shut down to the point of total immobility by your limbic system, which is the part of our brain that manages stress. So we've got this mechanism that wants to keep us alive. It mobilizes our resources to fight, to survive, or flee and escape. But when there's no real solution in the computer, what happens is we shut down and we go into this kind of paralysis state. And whether we go into paralysis or we panic, right, neither one of those is a good solution. So specific to the mass homicide, specific to active shooters, as we're talking about today, and we say, well, what can citizens do? If you don't have a lot of ability to get into, say, a self-defense class that is competent at teaching this, my recommendation is the current protocol of run, hide, fight, that is typically what you hear and what is taught around, the United States. There's nothing wrong with this protocol, okay? I would say the only limitations or the only little nuances that I want people to be aware of dealing with the idea of run, hide, fight is that the words have power and meaning, okay? And if you actually think about the words themselves, it's fine to remember the protocol that way. It's like stop, drop, and roll. But think of it like this. What is the first thing that actually has to happen before you run or hide or fight? What do you have to do first, Bob?
Make that decision?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I mean, you got to process, right? You got to think through what's going on, assess what's happening, and then make a decision. Do I run? Is the best solution to hide? Is the best solution to fight? Yeah. And exactly. And the problem that I have with the word run, and again, we are talking nuances and splitting hairs. I don't have a problem with run, hide, fight. I teach that protocol. I just try to expand the understanding of it. The idea of running implies panic. Oh my God, at the first sign of trouble, I'm going to flee in the opposite direction. Sometimes moving quietly or slowly is the better solution. Sometimes you want to move in a more tactical way, or you want to make other decisions that, there's nuance here. So what really has to happen is the idea of distancing yourself from the danger. And to distance yourself from the danger, to run away from it, is you really got to assess first what's going on and decide where's the best place to go, and is that the right solution? When we look at the second facet of this, of hiding, colloquially, I don't have a problem with the idea of hiding. Hiding, as that second dimension, is intended to delay contact with the intruder. So what you're really trying to do is clear the decks, get off the X, and let the lifeguards get there. Give them time to get there and respond and manage the threat. The problem is that hiding to most people, and I see this again and again and again in the way we actually see people going into lockdown, is they hide under tables and chairs or things like that that can't possibly provide you any cover. What hiding implies from a tactical standpoint is locking down, okay? And what that means is putting yourself into an environment that can legitimately delay contact as best as you are able. Now, one of the challenges, the practical challenges with that, is unless you're in a school or in an environment that has established lockdown safe areas, such as a classroom, nowadays, if there's a school out there that the classroom is not a legitimate lockdown safe area, that school's got a problem, okay? Because they are 20 years behind the 8 ball. The thing about it is, if you can duck into an environment, the problem is most of those environments, the doors will open outward due to fire code. So you really can't lock them down. And a lot of the irrational behavior that you see in the hiding phase is people putting tables or chairs against a door that opens outward that only now limits your ability to get to the assailant or get out if you had to. So the tactical decision-making that goes around and thinking through, once again thinking, is when you're in a hiding moment and saying we're going to take cover in the stockroom of the American Eagle Outfitters at the mall if there's a shooting, right? That's a perfectly reasonable solution. We'd take cover, get back in, lock down into that stockroom. But if you can't lock down the door, if you can't physically barricade yourself in, then the best solution is to position yourself to be able to fight if the threat comes through that door. And that's where you have to then have some skills to say, okay, what am I going to do if this guy comes through that door? And my recommendation for the people who don't have a chance to go through a training like you did, or because there really are not that many of these kinds of legitimate trainings out there. But if you don't have access to that, my recommendation is keep life simple, all right? Remember that the tool in the person's hands are going to be what's going to hurt you, all right? If it's a firearm, if it's a knife, whatever it is, get to the guy's hands, control the weapon, and basically establish a point where you can attack, from a position of advantage, whether when they come through the door you can blindside them, whatever it is. So hiding in the far corners of the room, for example, is not the solution. So as a very rapid recap, we got to think first. If we can distance ourselves from the threat, that's the best solution to get out, right? If we can't, then we delay contact, right? We hide in a lockdown environment, but we're strategic. Put yourself in a position where you can fight back if that person comes through the door. And if they do, go for their hands. Keep it simple.
I don't know if people appreciate, but if you understand that a first principle about panic or freeze, just these few things you've said today, if people were to internalize that, greatly increases their chance of making the right decisions and surviving. So,
exactly.
Like you said, one of the tips that I remember clearly is like in a typical school environment. You have a door with a window on it, and people tend to natural instinct is to get as far away from the door as possible. But then you're seen from outside the room. So the shooter knows there's people in that room. Where the best thing to do is to get right next to the door, the same wall that the door is on, and at the side of the door where it would open. So if they don't hear anything, they may not even come in. If they do come in, then as you said, you're in a position to grab them and do something. But even the idea of making sure before you barricade a door, make sure it opens in, not out. I mean, that could save someone's life right there. But again, in that mode, if no one's ever mentioned these things, your brain has never considered it. It's like a lookup table. I imagine it. In a panic situation, your brain has nowhere to go.
That's right.
It has you're figuring it out, and as it happens, and things happen so quickly that you don't have a whole lot of time to sit there and have a discussion.
Probably the most important truth of any kind of disaster or crisis management is that the time to prepare for a crisis is not during the crisis. It's afterward. Excuse me. It's beforehand. So
Right.
it's not afterwards. It's beforehand. So the idea here is that we just don't, as people, we just don't make good decisions under stress. We really want to think through these things now, right? This is the time, not in the moment of truth. Mm-hmm. And, I'll share a very quick story with you, okay? And I know that, Rudy Giuliani got a lot of, negative kind of dynamics, in the last few years, but let's go back a step. This story relates to post 9/11. One thing you could never take away from Rudolph Giuliani is New York's emergency response capability after 9/11 and their ability to kind of manage that massive scale of a crisis was really astonishing when you look at it, of how they pulled the pieces of the puzzles together to deal with that. And I remember hearing Rudy Giuliani talk one time about that. And someone asked him, did you specifically, as a city, prepare for the possibility of the Twin Towers collapsing? And I'm kind of paraphrasing this conversation. Sure. And he basically said, no, they had not actually prepared for that specific eventuality. And that's kind of evidenced because their primary command center was actually in one of the Twin Towers. All right, they figured those are the safest places in the city. Wow. So he said the way they were able to manage that emergency, even when their command center was taken out, and they had such a devastation that no one had ever actually anticipated that scale, was that they had prepared for so many other possibilities that they were very quickly able to adapt a plan around that and say, we need power, here's where we get power. We need command center, here's a fallback location. We need additional support in this element or that element, here's where we pull those together. So the exercise, as you said, of just mentally rehearsing this and saying, if I'm here and something goes wrong, where do I go? What would I do? Just taking a moment to mentally rehearse those options is a game changer in terms of your ability to react. And it doesn't mean that the fight, if you will, has to follow the exact model that you believe it will. You have the ability to adapt now. And that really is our greatest strength as a species, is adaptability. So in the moment of crisis, the key is to have prepared in some capacity ahead of time. The nature of this, of just thinking through this, my recommendation, Bob, for anyone who's listening to this or seeing this is make a habit just for a short amount of time, even if it's just for the next week or so. Anywhere you go into a restaurant, just take a mental note of where there is a secondary exit from the point you walked in. So where's the kitchen, for example, of the restaurant? There's an exit through the kitchen. If you go to a concert, that there's an exit over the stage. If you're closer to the stage than you are an emergency exit, maybe that's your exit route. Take 30 seconds to think through those things. What that'll do is it'll start to get your mind in the habit of looking at your environment more strategically. And for anyone who says, well, I don't want to live my life in fear, that's not living in fear. That's living with a degree of healthy preparedness. Living in fear is actually not having any idea what you would do and just hoping and praying that things don't kick off.
One of the ideas out there's a lot of talk about the gun, the AR-15, the military thing. And I think that's harmful as well, because I think it gives people the impression that there's a super powerful gun that anyone that possesses it is, invulnerable. They can do anything they want to do. Meanwhile, the case in Texas, the self-defense case, the guy driving the Uber shot the man armed with an AK or an AK or a AR-15. He shot him with a revolver. And in your class, we learned how just with your bare hands you can disarm someone. And quite frankly, some of these murderers that come in there to kill people, they're not well prepared either. Some of them have, but not all of them are. I thought about in the Pulse nightclub, they described how the guy was standing there. All the people were against the wall, just this crowd of people, and he was just firing at them. Mm-hmm. And, I thought in that case, if just one person decided to go after him, then that would spur other people likely to respond the same way. And, you take them down. I mean, sure, some people are going to get killed, but why would you stand there and just be a target like that and say, boy, I hope he doesn't hit me?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to that question. There's a lot to that line of thought, okay? And to sort of circle back to what we started this discussion with, Bob, when I hear that people just lined up against the wall or played dead or had no capacity to fight back, I'm not surprised at all, because what we're seeing there is exactly how the human brain and limbic system and body is sort of designed to react under those most extremes. It's a survival mechanism. Playing dead, total submission, is a survival mechanism that's kind of hardwired into us from probably primal days where we had to worry about being mauled by a bear, right? If you cross between a bear and its cubs, you want to make sure that it leaves you, it might attack you, but it'll assume, okay, he's dead, I'll move on to the next thing. There's no more threat. The challenge with human predators, obviously, is that it's a survival mechanism that could get us killed, in the face of a human predator, simply because whether we live or die depends on whether the bad guy chooses to kill us. Now, but I'm not surprised by the behavior. So when I've heard politicians, and I've heard this, after an incident like the Pulse nightclub or like, whatever, you take your pick of any of these, people say, why don't they just rush the guy? Well, that really comes down to prior training and prior having a plan, a decision to make. If we look at schools as a classic example, I have been absolutely blown away by the courage of most teachers and administrators. I will tell you, I don't think courage is the issue or a lack thereof. They will absolutely put their bodies in front of those children. The problem is they don't know what the hell to do when they get there. So unfortunately, what ends up happening is they end up getting killed instead of having some capacity to fight back. So, there's a saying that we use in my business, Live Ready. That's the name of my company, is that, really, willingness is a state of mind. Readiness is a statement of fact, okay? You have to have the skills and those plans in place. So when I see those events happen and people don't react, I'm not surprised. That is the normal default setting. That being said, Bob, you are never helpless. And people truly believe that if a person has a gun, there's nothing you can do. And that is, to me, the greatest myth of helplessness that there is. Because you can always fight back. And even if you have the severe disadvantage of someone having a firearm and you don't, that doesn't mean that you are helpless. You can always do something if you can control your mind. You can take your shot when you have a chance, so to speak. Now, that being said, there's lots of evidence to support that and substantiate that. There's to the point where the FBI statistics come out every year, and there's a little bit of a difference there of how often ordinary citizens fight back and defend themselves, but it may vary between 18 and 30%, okay? And to some degree, what we're looking at, and these are citizens stopping active shooters in their tracks, not necessarily with firearms, just with their bare hands. That's a game-changing perspective. Now, when you start to look at those statistics and you look deeper, we understand that all statistics can be a little bit skewed based on the data pool, right? One of the data pool elements that skews things is the FBI is only looking at incidences where there's like 4 or more casualties. Well, how many events were stopped by citizens before it reached that point? Okay. On top of that, very often we already know that most of these events are over by the time law enforcement arrives, and the vast majority of the time, the bad guy's killing themselves. Okay, Now, they usually kill themselves at the first sign of resistance. So, in other words, the police arrive, the jig is up, they take their own life, because that's part of their mission, if you will. They don't want to be captured very often. Sometimes it's not the case. But very often they don't want to shoot it out with the cops. They just want to kill themselves to ensure that they're not going to be captured. That being said, a lot of times they're killing themselves at the first sign of resistance, and that resistance is ordinary people coming at them, right? So when they realize the jig is up, they can't manage it, and it's like a house of cards that collapses. So, we're talking about a relatively complex matter in a very short amount of time, and I'm sort of throwing some statistics and data out there that I would normally evolve over a much larger conversation. But what I want people to understand is that there is evidence, there's plenty of historical evidence to demonstrate that this isn't just some fiction of me saying you can disarm a gun, all right? There's lots of science that we can explain and demonstrate of what advantages you do have and how you can actually do it successfully from a technical basis, how easy it is, relatively speaking, from a mechanical basis, but also how much evidence there is to substantiate that we can, in fact, as unarmed populace, defend ourselves against an armed intruder. They're definitely not some kind of unstoppable killing machine that only a trained and armed and armored law enforcement officer can stop them. It's not the case.
Right.
I can give you examples. I'll give you one example in particular, if you don't mind me kind of rambling on a minute, Bob.
Go on. So,
after the Tree of Life incident, as an example, all right, this horrific incident that we faced in Pittsburgh, okay, as night follows the day, right? The news media makes a big deal out of these things, and we start to see copycat events. Several months after the Tree of Life, there was another major, horrific mass shooting in New Zealand, all right, in Christchurch, New Zealand. In this case, another white supremacist decided he was going to target a series of mosques. Do you remember this incident?
Yep, I do.
So what happened was, what was novel about this incident, these killers love to do things that are novel, is the guy live streamed the attack on Facebook. Okay? Now, in one of the very few moments where social media actually enacted some kind of competent response to something, Facebook, in fact, did lock that down pretty quickly. All right? However, I did get to see the video. I've seen it. I've analyzed it. I don't want to say privileged to do so. Some things you never want to see, and you can't get it out of your head ever since, once you see it, okay? If you're a decent person, you don't want to look at that stuff. I had to look at it from a tactical standpoint and an educated standpoint. First thing that happens, I'm going to break this down very quickly. The guy walks into the first mosque with a shotgun. He murders the first few people he sees. Those shotgun blasts alert pretty much everyone in the area that there was a horrific incident going on. The whole place goes into kind of a little bit of a lockdown type of panic reaction. He drops the shotgun, picks up some type of an AR-style rifle. I don't know what exact make and model, but it was a semi-automatic rifle. And he walks into the main... I don't know whether it was the sanctuary or sort of an antechamber, like a foyer before the sanctuary. It's a big room. And you see him on this Facebook video panning left and then panning right. And when he pans to the right, there's a whole group of people laying on the ground, okay? And they're not moving. And they're laying on top of each other. And he starts shooting into this mass of people. And you're seeing this, and you're seeing people getting hit. And not a single person moved. No one got up and ran. No one did anything. And this is an example. Like, I remember when this video, the first moment this hit the social media stream, a lot of people are like, oh, it's clearly a false flag attack. These people were already murdered and set in place. That is not the case. What we were seeing there was an exact example of tonic immobility and that total paralysis that we have talked about. Okay. Now, as soon as he, engaged these folks, and he's changing magazines and stuff, you see him flash back to his left. just in time on the edge of the camera to see someone trying to tackle him. Now, a fight ensues, right? A few moments later, you see him kind of elevate the gun, and he shoots the guy, and that's the end of that attack, that disruptive attempt. Well, he runs out of targets functionally at the first mosque, gets back in his car, and starts going to his second target, right? As he's on his way to the second target, the other mosques in the area got wind of what was going on, and we're all in lockdown, right? There was a dad in one of the mosques, in the second mosque, who said, I don't want to be hiding behind these closed doors. I want to be outside paying attention to see if this guy shows up. So he's out on the street. As the bad guy arrives, the dad sees him coming, okay, and engages him, if you will. They fired a few shots through the glass of the mosque. This guy engages him in sort of a cat and mouse game of he's throwing stuff at him. He had an improvised weapon that he threw at him, and he was sort of like popping out from behind cars and telephone poles, drawing his fire, drawing his attention, causing confusion, right? At one point, the shooter drops his rifle because it's out of ammunition, and he goes back to his car to get another rifle. This dad runs up, picks up the rifle that's empty, has no idea how to handle it, okay, and is trying to make it work. The shooter knows that the gun's out of ammunition, but he still panics, right, which is very common because the bad guys go through the same type of panic paralysis that we do in these situations. The difference is that most bad guys tend to panic because their mission starts to fall apart. So he panics. He jumps in his car, tries to drive away, at which time this dad takes the rifle and literally throws it like a spear, hitting the windshield of the car. And that's the reason why the cops were able to catch him so quickly, was because functionally the windshield was smashed. You know what I mean? They were able to pick up on this guy as he was exiting. So the reason I share this story in this kind of blow by blow is because there's a lot of lessons here. The first lesson is this guy, this dad who saved the day, God only knows how many more casualties there would have been. He disrupted this attack with nothing but his wits, all right? Mm-hmm. He didn't have any armor or special training or firearms to shoot back. He did it with nothing but his wits and thinking through, I'm not going to be a victim sitting on the inside here. I'm going to figure out a way to fight back, okay? Mm-hmm. The first guy, who was another hero who tried to tackle him, got to him. The only mistake he made was he didn't know to go for the gun, right? He went for the guy, and it's the gun that can hurt you. So he made a tactical error. But nonetheless, what we saw there was one person who succeeded in reaching the bad guy and could have won that fight if things had just gone a little differently for him, or if he'd known a little bit more, right? Mm-hmm. And then another guy who successfully managed to disrupt that attack from any further harm, as horrific as it already was. These are lessons to me that I look at and say, these are people who we want to know. We want to know their stories, these heroes who take action. Forgive me, I don't remember those folks' names. It's a shame. I will make sure that I know their names to be able to relate it. But I don't normally relate this story on a daily basis. But that being said, I just wanted to share that because it really illuminates, our advantages that we do have.
It's troubling that the media doesn't report any of these things. They just want to report how bad everything is. Mm-hmm. And like you said, they ignore the incidents where the people defended themselves. I mean, one of the things, I was wondering if I heard this from you. Now I know that I did, was how do you stop someone whose plan at the end of all this is to die? They want to die anyway. So how do you stop them? Mm-hmm. And it's not that their life that they want to protect, but the mission, like you said. Mm-hmm. So if they feel like they're not going to be successful, the payoff here is the infamy, all the attention in the media, and that they're going to get. So if that's threatened, they're going to avoid that target. And quite frankly, the more people in the public learn how to defend themselves and thwart these things, the less of them they're going to happen. Because right now they're like almost a guaranteed success for these people. Yeah. And so, if we can threaten the mission with a little bit of security and just a mindset among the people that we're going to stop it, The other thing is, I know the brain, you think about charging a gun, and that's inherently a dangerous thing to do. So your brain's not going to want you to do that. But if, as you said, if you're trained ahead of time, you stand there, you're going to die. The guy's going to shoot you. So you have a better chance of survival by doing something counterintuitive, which is go for the gun. The instinct is that gun's going to kill me. Hide from the gun. Don't go. But at the end of the day, if you thought it through, then going after the guy and fighting him is a better chance of survival.
Yeah. Bob, I'll give you one last perspective on that, and then I'm going to have to sign off, okay?
Okay, sure.
But to capstone what you just said, two things you said. First of all, you're spot on, absolutely correct. Bad guys of this type, whether they're school shooters, workplace shooters, terrorists, they're all functionally terrorists, okay? The only real differentiator is ideology. Some are politically motivated, other ones are personally motivated. But at the core, what they're most afraid of is failure of their mission, right? If they can't get to enough targets, if they can't make enough impact, nobody will ever hear their name, okay? They need to make a big event, something new, something that you've never seen before. That's their ticket to, as you thought of infamy, that's their ticket to sort of fame and glory in their minds, okay? So to deter them, what we want to do is understand what they're afraid of, and what they're afraid of is not dying or getting hurt or getting caught. What they're deathly afraid of is being stopped before they complete their mission. And that's why it is so important that environments become hard targets. One of the things that I take personal exception to is this very common vernacular that I hear nowadays by politicians. We don't want to turn our schools into prisons. How is having armed guards and having appropriate security measures turning a school into a prison? We have armed guards all over the place in society.
Yeah, is the White House a prison?
It's absolutely ludicrous, and it's absolutely, it's like, it's almost like malfeasance. It's like using the words and intentionally using fear to try to prevent people from doing the right behaviors or behaviors that could help matters.
They're using emotion to skew logic is what
that's
they're
right.
doing. Yeah.
Now,
it's complete deception.
And to kind of capstone the point you made about sometimes the only way out is through, right? You got to go through. I'll use an analogy. When I was in the Marines, I learned about this idea, a basic infantry tactic called the L-shaped ambush, okay? Now, if I had a whiteboard, I'd draw it for you, but you're going to have to imagine here's a road that makes an L. If you're going to ambush a target like a convoy coming down that road, you don't want to set up your forces on both sides so that they end up in a crossfire shooting each other, right? What you do is you set up one group here and one group here so that you have this kind of cross-hatching of fire so that when the target is on the X, you've got this kill zone, okay? Well, the question is, if you're on the X, if you're the one on the ambush site, in an L-shaped ambush, where do you go, right? You can't go backwards. They'll just shift their fire, and you're still in that crossfire. If you go this way, they shift their fire, and you're still in the crossfire. There's only one answer. That answer is to go through, all right? You have to literally turn to the enemy.
And start pointing at each other.
That's right. And you completely disrupt that attack by doing the least intuitive thing possible, which is literally going right at the guns and closing with that enemy to destroy that enemy force, okay? That's the only way out. No other way out works. So from a mindset standpoint, being willing, right? In my mind, first you got to be willing. You got to have a willingness to fight back, to recognize that you are someone worth defending, right? And then you have to add the ability and say, okay, in this moment, what would I do? And if the only decision is to go straight at that bad guy or throw a chair at him and then, tackle him, do it. If that's the only way out is to get through that guy, then do what you got to do. But you got to mentally rehearse that. In an ideal world, you got to practice. You got to actually physically train and, physically rehearse. So, I'm on a mission to do that. The terrorists are on a mission of their own kind. My mission, Bob, is to reach as many people as I can and empower them with these skill sets, these essential skill sets. And I'll tell you, Bob, there's two things, if I can just shamelessly promote myself for a moment.
Please do.
In November, hopefully we will make this deadline. I'm planning on the release of a book I've been working on for a number of years. And it's called Live Ready. And that forthcoming book will be the summation of everything I've learned over the last almost 30 years. Okay. And in keeping with that, I'm in the process of developing a lot of my programs into online curriculums, so that the type of training you received, at the moment, my intention is to offer that free to the public. So, I really want to have a website where if people don't know what to do in these situations, they can go to that website and they can get the fundamentals of this type of training right from their computer from anywhere in the world. And I want to reach about 1 million people. That's my goal. So, I've already reached almost 100,000 people with my training hands-on. I want to get to 1 million, and the only way to scale that is through leveraging the communications age that we're in. And that's going to be my goal. And we'll be having, this program will be live. The program you went through is called ASSERT, Active Shooter Survival, Escape, and Response Tactics. That class will probably be on the website definitely by the fall. We've just got a lot of filming and editing to do, but it'll be there. And it'll be available. It'll be digestible for people, that even if they don't have the ability to physically train with a training partner, you'll get a ton out of that training and really put these plans in place. So, but thank you. Thank you for having me on here.
That's great. I mean, I actually wrote a note on here, tell them to write a book. So I'm glad you said that. That's awesome. Thank you so much, Sam. I really enjoyed this. I think this is going to be great. I really hope a lot of people see this.
Thank you, Bob.